Several lectures ago, we described the various sources of power that a leader might employ in order to get things done. One source was the power associated with the formal position they held within an organization's structure or social hierarchy. And we saw that formal position, power, could be very useful for a leader. Clearly, though, leading change and transformation effectively requires the exercise of influence without authority at times. Formal authority can be very useful, but it's not the only way to lead change. Formal authority alone cannot be the mechanism by which leaders act at all times. They must have the capability to persuade. So we're in a section of the course where we began by talking about the exercise of power. We're moving toward talking about persuasion, and eventually in the next module we'll be talking about negotiation. The idea here is that leaders cannot always dictate. At times they must collaborate. How can they do that effectively? So we have three questions that we want to answer in this lecture. How do we become more effective at persuading others? Second, what's the typical approach that many leaders use, and why is that approach to persuasion often wrong? And finally, what are some practical techniques that we can use as leaders to become more effective in persuading others? Let's take a look at a historical example of someone who grappled with the challenges of persuasion and the need for persuasion as a leader. Richard Neustadt of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government wrote a seminal book on presidential leadership many years ago. In that book, he described the frustrations of President Harry Truman in the 1940s and early 50s. And he talked about the spring of 1952, when Truman was commenting on the challenges that Dwight Eisenhower would face if he won election and became president of the United States. Now remember, Eisenhower, a famous military general, had never served in elected political office up to that point. He had, of course, led the liberation of Western Europe as Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. He was a very formidable and effective leader. But here he was making quite a transition to political office, to leading the federal government, or at least he was considering it and trying to become elected. And Truman was concerned that he would have a hard time with that transition. According to Neustadt, Truman once said, "He'll sit here and he'll say, 'Do this, do that,' and nothing will happen. Poor Ike, it won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating." And indeed, Dwight Eisenhower experienced these frustrations at times after he was elected President of the United States, even though he had clearly learned quite well that even as a general, even as commander of the Allied forces, table thumping didn't do much good at times. Yet, it still was difficult to make that transition, to recognize that formal authority alone was not enough to get many of his priorities enacted. Neustadt reports that an Eisenhower aide told him in the latter years of Ike's presidency that the president still feels that when he has decided something, it ought to be the end of it. And when it bounces back undone or done wrong, he tends to react with a shocked surprise. The federal government involves many agencies and many different organizations, and each of the secretaries that lead those cabinet departments has its own power base and priorities and interests. And so simply dictating to them and expecting your policy will be enacted as intended simply doesn't work in many occasions. And of course, Truman knew this frustration quite well. He had experienced it during his time in the Oval Office. "I sit here all day," he said, "trying to persuade people to do the things they ought to have enough sense to do without my persuading them. That's all the powers of the president amount to." Truman recognized the limitations of the power of the presidency. That, in fact, not only did he have to work with Congress, but he had to work with all of these disparate agencies and departments, each of these silos that had its own agendas, its own goals and objectives, and it was difficult to get them to move. It was bureaucratic, yes, but there was more to it than that. It was a complex organization where many different subunits, yes, have certain shared common goals and objectives, but also conflicting ones at times. Neustadt concluded in his book that the President of the United States has an extraordinary range of formal powers, of authority in statute, law, and in the Constitution. And yet, he wrote, he does not obtain results by giving orders, or not at any rate merely by giving orders. He has extraordinary status, but he has to have the power to persuade. That's what presidential power is, said Neustadt. indeed true for the President of the United States, the leader of the free world. If it's true for the President, it's certainly true for leaders at all levels in all sorts of organizations. Formal authority alone does not grant them the ability to get things done. They must be able to persuade. Now, Jay Conger is one of the leading experts on persuasion in the field of organizational behavior. And he has argued that command and control simply is no longer the method that many leaders can use to be effective. That perhaps command and control worked in decades past, but there have been fundamental changes in the workforce and in the nature of organizations that require less use of command and control and more emphasis on persuasion. He points out that organizations tend to be far less hierarchical today than they were in the 1950s and 60s. People describe them as networked organizations, where it's flatter and when you're working laterally across different departments and units. Cross-functional teams of peers are getting projects done, having to collaborate despite working for different bosses. And of course, there are lots of folks from Generation X in the workforce, and they have different attitudes about authority and about responsibility and accountability. And so we need to lead differently, says Conger. All this, he argues, means persuasion is more important today than ever. And it's not just about being a great salesperson for a particular product or service. Certainly we know that salespeople have to be persuasive. But it's an important issue for internal management of an institution as well. Now, some people worry about this emphasis on persuasion. They would argue that persuasion tactics are often perceived as manipulative. They think of them that way, and therefore it kind of turns them off. But Conger stresses to us that persuasion does not have to be deceptive. And one needs to put it in your toolkit if you'd like to be successful. Larry Bossidy is the very successful CEO of Honeywell. And he learned early on in his career that you certainly couldn't lead by command and control. And he says, the day when you could yell and scream and beat people into good performance is over. Now, what's interesting is that most people's definition, according to Conger, is wrong-headed when it comes to persuasion. Here's how they think about persuading others. He says they go through sort of a three-step process, typically. Most leaders do. They start by strongly stating their position, their vision, their plan of action. And then they move to step two, which is outlining their supporting arguments very assertively, declaring certain facts. And finally, they move toward closing the deal, sometimes employing the hard sell at that point to bring people to their side. And they're resisting compromise in most instances. This method or approach is about logic. It's about marshaling data. It's about being persistent in your efforts. And it's about passion and enthusiasm. The idea being, if you exhibit passion and enthusiasm for something, that'll bring people over to your side. But it's not sufficient, this approach, or even appropriate in many situations. Persuasion doesn't always have to be about simply winning people over to a view that you've already settled upon. Persuasion, according to Conger, can be a learning process, a process of negotiation and collaboration to get to better solutions that everyone buys in and commits to. So we have a very different view then, a very different perspective on what persuasion is. Not one of, I know best and I'm going to convince you, but I'm going to work with you to get to a solution that you are very much bought into and that you feel ownership of and that you're willing to move forward and help implement. And leaders at times have to shift gears. They can't always go in thinking they've got the entire solution settled upon and all they need to do is convince others. So what is this different approach to persuasion? What does it look like? What would be the steps that Conger would recommend a leader employ to persuade in this learning collaborative mode? He says first, a leader needs to establish credibility. And in this regard, expertise and relationships are key. Expertise and relationships are the basis upon which you establish credibility with peers and subordinates. And unfortunately, sometimes, often in fact, many individuals overestimate their own credibility, and this can be problematic. Now, where do we get the expertise that helps us be credible to others? Well, clearly a track record of proven performance in a particular domain helps us establish credibility. But at times, we're trying to persuade others and we don't have a deep track record. We may, in fact, be working slightly outside of our typical domain of knowledge and experience. What then does a leader need to do to establish credibility to persuade effectively? Well, they can turn certainly to outside sources, to people who are known by many people far and wide as experts in a particular domain, and bring them in to help bolster their view. They also might conduct experiments and pilots. Those sorts of studies and projects demonstrate the merits of what they are articulating, of what they would like to do. They come up with some sort of small win or success that people can look to, and that will help establish the leader's credibility. With regard to relationships, trustworthiness is key. And of course, it takes a long time to build up that trustworthiness, that credibility. But if you don't have it, if you don't have the depth of relationships required to be seen as credible by all the people you're trying to persuade, then you might look for others within the organization, or even outside the organization, who have strong ties to the audience that you are addressing. And those people may be your conduits. They may be your collaborators who help you influence the target audience. So finding people who are influencers, who are viewed as credible by the target audience, is critical if you don't have that credibility. Step 2, framing for common ground. Find the benefits for the audience in what you're proposing. Don't just look at it from your perspective. You know, Congress says when you're taking your child to the bank or somewhere else where they don't want to go, you remind them that there are lollipops at the counter. And of course, that helps persuade that child to come along. We've all done that, I think, with our children or grandchildren. In a business situation, there are similar ways in which you can look for the common ground, look for the interests of the audience that you're trying to persuade. Conger reminds us that in one instance that he studied, we had a retailer trying to persuade franchisees to enact a certain course of action. And it only worked. They were only able to persuade when they said, what's in it for the franchisee? Why would they do this, despite the fact that it's going to require a great deal of investment and some risk associated with putting that capital into play? We need to look at it from their perspective in order to persuade. Third step is providing evidence. And that's not just numerical data. That's stories, examples, metaphors, and analogies. Mary Kay Ash, founder of Mary Kay Cosmetics, loved to use analogies. One analogy that she used at times in convincing her associates of the power of the weekly meeting at Mary Kay, where the salespeople would get together to share ideas and then to think about how to sell. She would remind people of the power of the weekly meeting for the early Christians who were being persecuted, and how that was an important way for them to come together. And she would then draw analogy to her sales force and the weekly meetings that she proposed they implement. And finally, we have to connect emotionally. In other words, we have to understand the audience's emotional state when we try to persuade. Are they worried and fearful? What's the history of the situation that we're facing? How have they dealt with this issue in the past? Might they have been burned by this issue in the past? Might they be upset about how it's been handled in years gone by? And might that be affecting or clouding their view right now? We have to understand if our audience is fearful and then adopt a strategy that will address that. When I think about persuading others, I think often about somebody who may not have formal authority in the organization, but who may be challenging the conventional wisdom, who may have a dissenting view. And I'm often asked when I work with executives, if I don't have all the power and authority, how do I persuade others who might be higher up in the organization than me, especially if I have a dissenting view? And I give them a few strategies to employ, and I want to share those with you. First, know your audience. Learn about the person or people you're trying to persuade. Learn about their backgrounds. Learn about how they think and how they process information. Are they highly rational and analytical? Are they more emotional and intuitive? Understand the history of prior attempts to address this particular issue and of their role, and avoid placing blame when you do look at the history. Seek allies and build coalition. There's clearly strength in numbers. Find others who will support your viewpoint and then come together as a united front with you when you're trying to persuade. work through key gatekeepers. Who are gatekeepers? Gatekeepers are those folks who sit between you and people of high formal authority. Often a CEO may have a chief of staff, for example. Other times there's people who don't have a formal position that conveys they are a gatekeeper, but informally they serve as a gatekeeper. They are managing someone's schedule. They are a buffer between a senior leader and the rest of the organization. Working through them, persuading them first, can be an effective way to then bring senior people on board with you. Focus first on divergent thinking, rather than trying to convince someone that their approach is wrong and yours is right. Set as your near-term goal not to persuade them to adopt your view immediately, but instead simply get them to think differently about the issue. Get them to take a different perspective. Try to break them out of their existing mental model before you try to get them to adopt your perspective or mental model. And lastly, make sure you're presenting solutions, not just problems. Gerstner's "Don't tell me about the flood, but build me an ark" quote that he loved to use at IBM. Don't just point out the problem, offer some alternatives as to how to fix the problem. Not declaring that you know all the answers, but giving people some help in getting started on the problem-solving effort. All of those are effective ways to work with your audience and to persuade them. Now, Robert Cialdini is a famous scholar who's written perhaps the groundbreaking work on the psychology of persuasion, a book that has been a bestseller for years and years. In this work, he's identified what he calls the 6 major weapons of influence. And his work's been highly influential, not only in the field of psychology, but in the fields of leadership and marketing as well. Remember, influence and persuasion are clearly tactics that are instrumental in getting people to buy things that a company is selling. His 6 weapons are authority, commitment, reciprocity, social proof, liking, and scarcity. Now, that's lots of ground to cover, so we're going to cover the first 2 in this lecture. We'll turn to the other 4 in the upcoming lecture. So authority and commitment are our topics right now. So let's begin with authority, perhaps the method of influence that's most familiar to us. Many people, when they were freshmen or sophomores in college, remember taking an introductory psychology class. And perhaps in one of the very first weeks in that class, you were introduced to the work of Milgram, the so-called Milgram experiments about obedience to authority. Now, these are somewhat controversial experiments, as we'll talk about in a minute, but very profound. These experiments began in the early 1960s, around the time of the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And the question that Milgram was asking is, why were so many people complicit during the Holocaust? Why did they follow orders, despite the fact they may have had grave moral concerns about what they were doing? And so he set up a fascinating set of experiments to look at the issue of obedience to people in positions of authority. As I describe the experiments in a moment, you may have serious ethical questions about his approach, about what he did to his experimental subjects. And certainly many other scholars did as well. Almost every major research university in the world now has something like a human subjects committee that reviews every piece of research that's like this to make sure that you're not having some negative effect on human beings when you're conducting your study. Nevertheless, it's important that we learn from Milgram, even if we do have some qualms about his approach, because the lessons from his experiments are quite important, quite profound. What did he do? Well, he established one person as a learner and the other as a teacher in his experiment. And the confederate, the person working with him as the experimenter, was the person set up to be the learner. The teacher in the experiment was supposed to instruct the learner regarding some word pairs. And the teacher was told to administer an electric shock to the learner if the learner got the incorrect answer. And the voltage was to increase with each incorrect response. Now, there was no actual shock going on, but the person who was being asked to be the teacher had no idea that this was the case. And there was this experimenter in a white coat, very much looking like a person of authority, a professor, who was running the experiment, telling them to administer the shock. In fact, there were pre-recorded sounds of someone reacting to a shock. That is what the teacher was hearing, not the actual learner responding. They also, in some versions of the experiment, were told that the learner who was receiving these shocks had a heart condition. And in fact, in addition to hearing sounds of them in pain when the shock hit, they also at times heard pounding on the wall after incorrect answers and the administration of the shock. Now, of course, you might imagine many of the teachers in this experiment paused and showed concern and got very uncomfortable and even tried to stop at times, but the experimenter would encourage them to go on in those instances. Well, what were the results of Milgram's experiments? About 2/3 of the subjects administered the highest level of shock in the early versions of these experiments. It's amazing to see these on video, and they were captured on video, to watch how people are persuaded to administer a series of shocks to another human being. What's interesting is that Milgram actually had another group of students read a copy of the experimental procedure. And when all they did was read a copy of it, it turns out they grossly underestimated how likely it was that individuals would administer the shocks. Milgram concluded that there was a deep-seated sense of authority, of duty to authority within us all. Of course, authority can run amok at times. And interestingly, the white lab coat, I'm reminded of the fact that we have many medical errors in the healthcare industry. And some have said that the role of authority structures in healthcare settings contributes to the pervasiveness of medical errors, because lower-level folks in the status hierarchy don't want to question the doctor in the white coat, who may be making a mistake. But because of duty to authority, others allow that mistake to take place without being questioned. Well, note I refer to the white coat here, because authority involves symbols. What types of symbols may matter beyond just the substance of someone's authority? Well, their title, their clothing, their trappings, all those things do matter in exercising persuasion through authority. You know, we began this section of the course by focusing on how persuasion is a necessary leadership capability, because formal authority alone is not enough to compel people to change behavior. But authority figures are important in helping us persuade, and we may draw authority figures in to help us at times in persuading others to go along with a particular course of action. That authority figure doesn't have to be the leader himself or herself. It may be others that they bring in to help them persuade and influence. So we see that outside experts can be a critical tool in any change process. Consultants, professors, other experts from beyond the organization can be brought in as authority figures to help us influence. Now, what's interesting, you have to ask the question, what is the institution from which those experts come? That will matter a great deal, because some institutions will convey a greater sense of authority than others. Many businesses, for example, love to draw parallels to the military, and they recruit leaders from the military. Well, why would they do that? Well, clearly, the military does a wonderful job of training future leaders. But also a reason may be that the military as an institution brings with it a sense of authority that can persuade people to behave in certain ways. Are there dangers here when we're talking about the use of outside authority? I think there is. The danger for me often is that I see organizations bringing in outside authority figures to be scapegoats at times. Think about many businesses that hire consulting firms. You know, the joke about consulting firms is, what they really do is say, give me your watch and I'll tell you what time it is. Well, but there's a kernel of truth there, and I don't think it's because consulting firms aren't doing a good job. It's often because they're being hired where an agenda exists, and they're sort of being hired simply to be the scapegoat for tough decisions that are likely to be highly unpopular in the organization. The leader doesn't want to be the one to be seen as so unpopular, so the consulting firm becomes the scapegoat. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we sometimes jumping to the wrong conclusions based on certain symbols of authority? Are we sometimes seeing authority being used incorrectly in the persuasion process? I'll close this discussion just by reminding you that sometimes we put too much weight in the symbols of authority. Think about a doctor who you go and visit who perhaps doesn't wear a white coat and consults a book in trying to diagnose your condition. You probably would react quickly and have many doubts about that doctor. They're not wearing the white coat, they're having to look it up in a book, when in fact they may be very conscientious in trying to make sure their diagnosis is accurate. But we jump to that conclusion. We have some preconceptions about those authority figures, and they affect us a great deal. The second weapon that we want to talk about is the notion of commitment and consistency. Cialdini says we have a strong desire, a nearly obsessive desire or need, to behave in a manner consistent with our prior actions. This is deeply rooted in human nature. And this, of course, was described by Festinger in his theory of cognitive dissonance. That theory says that we are troubled when we try to hold conflicting ideas simultaneously. In those circumstances, people tend to try to find ways to reduce the dissonance. And one way of doing that is acting consistently over time. We don't want to contradict ourselves. We don't want to reverse course because that would lead to a great deal of dissonance. That would mean we're saying we made a mistake, and we don't like saying that at times. Knox and Inkster did a very famous study of gamblers at a racetrack. And what they showed was that the gamblers were more confident in a horse's chances of winning after they made the bet. Right? Because once you've made the bet, you have to rationalize that decision. And you rationalize it to the point where you actually bolster your confidence in that choice. So what does this have to do with persuasion? Well, if we can get individuals to commit to a certain course of action, then we can use their desire for consistency to persuade them to act in a certain way moving forward. Can this be used in a manipulative way? Absolutely. Let's take a look at an example. The captured prisoners of war in the Korean War. How were they treated by the Chinese? Well, one strategy the Chinese employed for compelling those POWs to provide information was actually a start small and build strategy. In other words, they didn't start out by asking them to publicly denounce the United States and to publicly denounce democracy. They started by having them make inconsequential statements, small statements about the nation, about the war. And then they pushed for a little more information and bolder statements. We call this technique the foot in the door technique. This building on the desire for consistency by having people make incrementally larger commitments over time. Friedman and Fraser conducted a famous experiment about this. They asked people to display a small 3-inch square sign about driver safety on their homes or in their yards. And then they went back to those same households 2 weeks later and asked them to display a large public service billboard on their lawn. Those who had received the initial request 2 weeks earlier were much more likely to comply with the second request. And they replicated this compliance even when the initial request had nothing to do with driver safety. When they asked people to sign a petition about state beautification and then went back and asked about the public service billboard regarding safety, they still got high compliance. They argued that what was happening was by asking people for that small commitment, you were changing the way that people view themselves. They sort of viewed themselves as more activist, at believing in advocating for certain desirable public policy goals. And that they made them more likely to comply with another request related to a different public policy goal. The foot in the door technique. People want to be consistent in their actions. The most persuasive commitments are ones that are public, active, and effortful, and absent of outside pressures. Why is that important? Because we accept inner responsibility for our behavior, says Cialdini, when we think we have chosen to perform it in the absence of strong outside pressures. The downside to commitment strategies is clear. We've talked before about the sunk cost effect, that people have a hard time cutting their losses, and a tendency to escalate their commitment to failing courses of action in the face of high sunk costs, to throw good money after bad. So if we persuade people through a strategy of extracting a series of commitments, the question becomes, can we then get them to alter their behavior, to reverse course when we wish to? The horse is out of the barn. We may not be able to stop them and turn them around. And that's a very dangerous thing. You know, Emerson once said, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. People often omit the word foolish from that quote. But the foolishness is what we have to worry about when we use consistency as our strategy for persuasion. Do we have an example, a famous example of someone who used consistency and commitment to persuade very effectively? I would argue that Winston Churchill used it amazingly effectively in gradually cajoling Franklin Roosevelt to commit more and more to the Allied cause, even in the face of pressures within the United States that called for isolationism. You have to recall that in the late 30s, America's feelings were highly isolationist. It did not want to be drawn into the war in Europe. And Churchill was pleading with Roosevelt for assistance. He felt very strongly, going back to the late 30s, that if this war was to become a huge issue in Europe, it only could be won against Hitler with the aid of the United States. And he engaged in an unyielding, persistent effort to bring Roosevelt to his side, to convert him from these isolationist feelings. Eventually, of course, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. fully into the war. But even before then, Churchill had drawn the Americans closer through a series of commitments that he elicited from Roosevelt. He made a famous speech to the American public in 1938 after the Czech invasion by Hitler. And there he began to make his plea, to make his address to Roosevelt, but also to the public at large. And then over time, he gradually elicited commitments. First, diplomatic support from Roosevelt. Then, in September of 1939, the cash and carry policy, where Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to revise the Neutrality Acts and allow the U.S. to sell material to belligerents of either side. Other nations would pay and transport these materials, but they must pay in cash. And then, in September of 1940, a year later, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, where 50 American destroyers were given to Britain in exchange for military base rights in the British Caribbean islands and Newfoundland. Then the Arsenal of Democracy speech in December of 1940, where the U.S. was going to build up its own arms and be ready for war, but also going to make arms that its allies could use. And finally, 3 months later, in March of 1941, the Lend-Lease Agreement, which directed military and economic aid to the UK and gave the British models of the United States' most advanced weapons to use. So gradually, Churchill brought Roosevelt along. What are the takeaways here from our first lecture on persuasion? We have to learn to persuade if we are to lead when we don't have positions of authority. But even with authority, we must persuade. And it's not just about the hard sell. We have to be careful that we don't take the wrong approach in trying to persuade. It's important to know our audience, even to collaborate with them in the persuasion process. We have to start by learning our audience. And we can use the power of commitment and consistency to gradually bring them along in our persuasion campaign. And a campaign it is, a process that must unfold over time. Persuasion is not an event that takes place in a single moment in time.